Millionaire went without sex for 2 years until he met his secretary. The truth will make you cry. Before we explore all the details of this incredible story, tell us where you're following us from and the time. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a thing, and let's embark on this journey together. A love story begins not with passion, but with silence. October 2024. The 42nd floor of Meridian Tower pierced Boston's morning sky like a steel needle, and Peter Johnson stood behind floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city wake up below. He shouldn't have been counting the days, but he was. 731 days since he'd last touched another human being with intention. 731 days since December 15th, 2022, since he'd allowed himself to feel desire, to be intimate with anyone, to remember what it meant to be a man instead of just a survivor existing in expensive suits. His reflection stared back at him from the glass, tall, broad-shouldered, with sandy brown hair perfectly styled and storm-grey eyes that had once been warm. Now they held the kind of emptiness that came from choosing numbness over pain. The charcoal Tom Ford suit fit him like armor, every thread designed to project power, control, untouchability. "Mr. Johnson?" The voice belonged to his current assistant, a nervous young man named Timothy, who'd lasted longer than most, 3 months. "Your 9 o'clock is here." Peter didn't turn around. "Send them to conference room B. I'll be there in 5 minutes. "Actually, sir, it's the interview for your new executive assistant. The agency said this candidate comes highly recommended." Executive assistant. The title felt foreign on his tongue. He'd gone through 7 assistants in 2 years, not because he was cruel, but because he was absent, distant, a ghost in an expensive suit who signed documents and attended meetings without ever truly being present. "Fine." He straightened his tie, a gesture so automatic it required no thought. Conference room A. The walk through his office suite felt longer than usual. His footsteps echoed against marble floors, past modern art he'd never really looked at, through hallways lined with awards and accolades that meant nothing to him anymore. Success without purpose, achievement without joy. Conference room. A smelled like fresh coffee and expensive leather. Peter settled into the chair at the head of the polished mahogany table, opening the candidate file without reading it. The ritual was always the same. Go through the motions, hire someone competent, maintain professional distance until they inevitably left for a position where their boss actually engaged with human beings. The door opened. "Good morning, Mr. Johnson. I'm Naomi Reed." Peter's head snapped up, and for the first time in 731 days, his carefully constructed walls trembled. She stood in the doorway with the kind of presence that filled a room without demanding attention. Naomi Reed was beautiful in a way that transcended physical features, though her deep brown skin seemed to glow in the morning light, and her natural hair was styled in elegant twists that framed her face perfectly. She wore a sophisticated navy dress that spoke of professionalism without hiding her natural grace. But it wasn't her appearance that made Peter's breath catch. It was her eyes, deep, intelligent, and surprisingly calm. They looked at him, really looked, without the mixture of intimidation and calculation he'd grown accustomed to. There was no agenda in her gaze, no attempt to impress or seduce or manipulate, just a quiet strength that seemed to say, "I see you. Please have a seat." His voice came out rougher than intended. Naomi moved with fluid confidence, settling into the chair across from him. She folded her hands calmly, waiting, not fidgeting, not rushing to fill the silence with nervous chatter, just present. Peter realized he'd been staring and forced himself to look down at her resume. "You've worked for Hartwell & Associates for 3 years. "Yes, sir. I've handled executive operations for the senior partners there." "Why are you leaving?" The question hung in the air. Most candidates launched into rehearsed explanations about growth opportunities and challenges. Naomi was quiet for a moment, considering. "Because I believe everyone deserves to work with people who value them," she said simply. "And I think some people need that more than others." Peter's pen stopped moving across the paper. He looked up again, searching her face for hidden meaning, for the catch. There was none. "This position requires discretion," he said, testing her. "My schedule is demanding. I don't tolerate personal drama or emotional complications." "I understand." Her voice remained steady, unaffected by his cold tone. "I'm not here to complicate your life, Mr. Johnson. I'm here to simplify it." Something twisted in his chest, an unfamiliar sensation he quickly buried. "The hours are long. I work late most nights." "So do I. I don't engage in small talk. I prefer meaningful conversations anyway." "I'm not He paused, struggling with words that felt foreign. I'm not easy to work for. For the first time since entering the room, Naomi smiled. It was soft, understanding, without a trace of judgment. Mr. Johnson, she said gently, I'm not here to make you easy. I'm here to make your job easier. There's a difference. The silence stretched between them, filled with something Peter couldn't name. He found himself studying the way afternoon light caught in her eyes, the way her hands remained perfectly still, the way she seemed to breathe calm into the room just by existing in it. When can you start? The words left his mouth before he'd consciously decided to hire her. Tomorrow if you need me to. If you need me. The phrase echoed in his mind long after she'd gathered her purse, shaken his hand with surprising warmth, and walked out the door. Peter remained in the conference room for another 20 minutes, staring at the chair where she'd sat. For the first time in 731 days, he found himself thinking about tomorrow, not dreading it, not enduring it, looking forward to it, and that terrified him more than anything had in 2 years. His phone buzzed with a text from Timothy. Should I call the next candidate? Peter deleted the message without responding. Outside the window, Boston hummed with life, and somewhere in the city, Naomi Reed was probably telling someone she'd gotten the job. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that she'd just walked into the life of a man who'd been holding his breath for 2 years. And for reasons he didn't dare examine, Peter Johnson suddenly felt like he might remember how to breathe again. But remembering how to breathe was only the beginning. The real question was whether he'd have the courage to let himself feel alive. Will Peter allow Naomi to break through the walls he's built around his heart? Or will his past prove stronger than his desperate need for connection? Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stay. Naomi arrived at Meridian Tower at exactly 7:30 the next morning, 30 minutes before her official start time. Not to impress, but because she'd learned that understanding someone's rhythm was the first step to supporting them effectively. And Peter Johnson was a man who clearly lived by precise rhythms. The 42nd floor was already humming with quiet activity. Through the glass walls of his corner office, she could see him at his desk, reading financial reports with the same intense focus a surgeon might reserve for a delicate operation. His coffee cup sat untouched beside his elbow, black coffee that had probably gone cold an hour ago. You're early. Timothy appeared beside her desk, looking harried. He was 26, fresh from Harvard Business School, still optimistic enough to believe he could crack Peter's emotional code. He's been here since 6, always is. Timothy lowered his voice conspiratorially. Fair warning, he's been through 6 assistants before you. I've lasted 3 months, which is apparently a record. The trick is not taking his coldness personally. He paused, studying her calm demeanor. Though something tells me you already figured that out. Does he eat breakfast? The question seemed to catch Timothy off guard. Eat? I don't know. I don't think anyone's ever asked. Naomi nodded thoughtfully, settling into her new workspace. The previous assistant had left it impeccably organized, but completely impersonal. No photos, no plants, no trace of human warmth. Like everything else in Peter's world, it was functional and emotionless. At 8 o'clock precisely, Peter's office door opened. Ms. Reed? His voice carried across the space with the same controlled distance from yesterday. I need the Hartwell contracts reviewed and the Morrison account files transferred to digital format. Of course, Mr. Johnson. She stood, notepad in hand. Would you prefer I work from the files here, or should I coordinate with their offices directly? Peter paused, clearly not expecting detailed questions. Most assistants simply nodded and figured it out later. Directly, but handle it diplomatically. Mario Balotelli is particular about transitions. I understand. I'll make sure he feels confident about the handover. She hesitated for just a moment. Mr. Johnson, your coffee's been sitting there for a while. Would you like me to bring you a fresh cup? Something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe even confusion. That's not necessary. I know it's not necessary, Naomi said gently, but I'm going to get myself some coffee anyway. It wouldn't be any trouble. He studied her face for a long moment, as if trying to decode hidden meaning in her offer. Finding none, he nodded curtly. Black? No sugar? Of course. When she returned 5 minutes later with 2 steaming cups, Peter was on a conference call, his voice sharp and commanding as he negotiated what sounded like a complex merger. Naomi placed his coffee within reach and retreated to her desk without a word. She didn't see him notice the small note she'd tucked under the saucer. Fresh start to a fresh day. But an hour later, when she glanced toward his office, the note was gone and the coffee cup was empty. The morning passed in a careful dance of professional efficiency. Naomi handled calls with the grace of someone who understood that being a gatekeeper meant protecting, not controlling. When Mario Balotelli called, a notoriously impatient Italian-American businessman who'd built his restaurant empire through sheer force of will, clearly testing the new assistant with a deliberately complicated request, she managed his demands with such diplomatic skill that Peter found himself pausing his work just to listen. "Mr. Balotelli, I completely understand your concerns about the timeline," Naomi was saying, her voice warm but firm. "What if I coordinate with your assistant to create a shared calendar for the transition? That way you'll have full visibility into every step of the process." Peter had seen grown men become frustrated to the point of shouting when dealing with Balotelli. The man had once made a senior partner cry over delayed paperwork. Naomi had just turned him into an ally. At noon, she knocked softly on his doorframe. "Mr. Johnson, I'm taking my lunch break. Is there anything you need before I go?" Peter looked up from his computer, realizing with surprise that 4 hours had passed without him being interrupted by incompetent questions or nervous energy. His office felt calmer than usual. "No, thank you." He glanced at his watch. "Be back by 1. "Of course." She turned to leave, then paused. "Mr. Johnson, when did you last eat something that wasn't coffee?" The question was asked so matter-of-factly, without judgment or manipulation, that Peter found himself actually considering it. When had he last eaten? "That's not your concern," he said, but without his usual edge. Naomi nodded. "You're right, it's not my concern, it's just observation." She left him sitting there, staring at the space where she'd been standing, wondering why a simple observation felt more personal than anything anyone had said to him in months. She returned at 1 o'clock with a small brown bag that she placed on her desk without comment. The afternoon proceeded much like the morning, smooth, efficient, peaceful in a way Peter's office hadn't felt in longer than he could remember. At 4 o'clock, she knocked again. "Mr. Johnson, I have the Morrison account files digitized and organized. Also, Mario Balotelli called to say he was impressed with our seamless coordination." A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "I think he wants to steal me. He can't have you." The words came out sharper than Peter intended, surprising them both. He cleared his throat. "The contracts, are they ready for my review?" "On your desk." She hesitated at the doorway. "Mr. Johnson, I noticed you have a standing appointment every Tuesday at 3. Should I block that time permanently, or would you prefer case-by-case scheduling?" Peter's hand stilled on the papers. Tuesday at 3. The cemetery. The weekly visit he'd never mentioned to anyone. Never put on any official calendar. "How did you—" "Timothy mentioned you're always unavailable Tuesday afternoons, but there's never anything on your calendar. I just want to make sure I schedule around it properly." She wasn't prying, she was simply noticing, being considerate of patterns that mattered to him, even if she didn't understand them. "Block it," he said quietly. "Permanently." "Done." She turned to leave again, then paused once more. "Mr. Johnson, there's a sandwich on your desk. Turkey and Swiss, nothing fancy. You don't have to eat it, but it's there." This time, she was gone before he could respond. Peter sat motionless for several minutes, staring at the carefully wrapped sandwich beside his computer. When had someone last brought him food? When had anyone noticed whether he was eating, sleeping, taking care of the basic requirements of human existence? The sandwich was perfect. Not too much mustard, fresh bread, exactly what he would have ordered if he'd thought to eat lunch. Somehow, Naomi had observed enough in one morning to understand his preferences without ever asking. He ate every bite. At 6:30, most of the office had emptied. Peter typically worked until 9 or 10, losing himself in numbers and strategies that demanded nothing of his heart. But tonight, he found himself distracted by the soft sound of typing from the outer office. He emerged to find Naomi still at her desk, a small reading lamp casting warm light over her workspace. She'd kicked off her heels under the desk and was working in her stockings, completely absorbed in whatever she was reviewing. "Ms. Reed," she looked up, and Peter felt that strange skip in his chest again, the same one from the interview yesterday. "Mr. Johnson, I hope I'm not disturbing you. I wanted to finish organizing your calendar for next month." "It's past 6:30. "I know." She saved her document and slipped her shoes back on. "I'm a bit of a perfectionist. Bad habit." "You don't need to stay late on your first day." Naomi stood, gathering her purse with the same graceful economy of movement he'd noticed yesterday. "I don't need to do a lot of things. I just prefer to do them well." She paused at the elevator bank and for a moment Peter felt an almost overwhelming urge to ask her to stay longer, to find some excuse, some additional task that would keep her voice in the office just a little while more. Instead, he said, "Good night, Ms. Reed." "Good night, Mr. Johnson." The elevator doors opened and she stepped inside. "Thank you for today. Thank you." As if working for him was a gift rather than a job. Peter returned to his office, but concentration eluded him. For the first time in 732 days, the silence felt different. Not empty, but expectant, as if it were waiting for something to fill it. On his desk, beside his computer, sat a small handwritten note. "Thank you for trusting me with your Tuesday afternoons. Whatever they mean to you, they're safe with me." Peter sank into his chair, holding the note in hands that weren't quite steady. Naomi Reed wasn't trying to fix him, wasn't pushing for information or offering unwanted advice. She was simply present, respectful, real. And for the second night in a row, he found himself looking forward to tomorrow. But tomorrow would bring its own challenges, because Peter was beginning to realize that the greatest danger wasn't Naomi trying to break down his walls. It was how effortlessly she was slipping through the cracks. Can Peter maintain his emotional distance when Naomi's quiet care is slowly melting defenses he's spent 2 years building? And what will happen when she discovers the real reason behind his Tuesday appointments? Love begins in the smallest gestures, grows in quiet moments, and blooms in unexpected silences. By Friday morning, Peter had stopped pretending he didn't look forward to seeing Naomi's car pull into the parking garage at 7:30 each day. Her silver Honda Civic, practical, reliable, unpretentious, had become as much a part of his morning routine as his first cup of coffee. What he hadn't expected was how thoroughly she would transform not just his office, but his entire approach to existing in the world. The changes were subtle. A small succulent plant now sat on the corner of her desk, its green leaves catching morning light. Classical music played softly from her computer speakers. Nothing intrusive, just enough to soften the harsh edges of corporate sterility. The coffee in the break room was suddenly better. She'd quietly replaced the standard blend with something that actually tasted like coffee instead of burnt water. But it was the notes that undid him. Every morning, tucked discreetly beside his coffee cup, Naomi left small handwritten messages. Not motivational quotes or cheerful platitudes that would have made him cringe. Just observations, thoughts, gentle acknowledgments of his humanity. "The sunrise was beautiful this morning, hope you noticed. You smiled at something on your computer yesterday. It looked good on you. Rainy days make the office feel cozier somehow. Thank you for saying please when you asked for the Jenkins files." Small kindnesses matter. Peter had never mentioned the notes, but they'd become as essential to his morning as breathing. He found himself saving them in his desk drawer, handling each small piece of paper like something precious. Friday afternoon brought an unexpected crisis. The Eastbridge merger, 6 months of careful negotiation, threatened to collapse over a legal technicality that had surfaced at the last minute. Peter's conference room filled with lawyers, executives, and nervous energy as voices grew sharp and tempers frayed. "This is exactly the kind of oversight that costs millions," snapped Gerald Hoffman, Eastbridge's lead counsel. "How did we miss this clause in the environmental assessment?" Peter felt the familiar ice settle over him, the cold control that had carried him through every crisis for the past 2 years. But as he prepared to deliver the kind of cutting response that would put everyone in their place and solve nothing, a soft knock interrupted the tension. "Excuse me, Mr. Johnson." Naomi's voice cut through the chaos like a warm breeze. "I have the original environmental reports from 2019 that might clarify the discrepancy." Every head in the room turned toward her. She stood in the doorway, holding a thick file folder, completely unbothered by the sea of expensive suits and hostile expressions. "How did you—" Gerald began. "I called the EPA office this morning when I saw the meeting on Mr. Johnson's calendar," Naomi explained calmly. "I thought it might be helpful to have historical context." She moved to the table and opened the folder with practiced efficiency. According to the original assessment, the clause in question was added as an amendment in 2020, which postdates the initial agreements. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed this information. Peter stared at her, something tight and grateful expanding in his chest. She'd anticipated a problem he hadn't even known existed and solved it before the crisis could escalate. "The amendment creates a separate compliance timeline," she continued, "which means the current merger can proceed under the original parameters while the new requirements are addressed in Phase 2. Gerald's expression shifted from hostility to grudging respect. "That's Actually brilliant. Why didn't our research team find this? Sometimes fresh eyes help, Naomi said diplomatically. Would you like me to coordinate with both legal teams to draft the amended timeline? An hour later, after handshakes and relieved laughter, the room had cleared. Peter remained at the conference table, still processing what had just happened. Miss Reed, she appeared in the doorway, somehow managing to look both professional and approachable despite having just saved a multi-million-dollar deal. Yes, Mr. Johnson, that was... He struggled for words that felt adequate. How did you know to research the environmental reports? I didn't know, she admitted, but you've been tense all week whenever the Eastbridge files crossed your desk, and you only get that particular line between your eyebrows when something's bothering you that you can't control. That particular line between your eyebrows. She'd been watching him closely enough to catalogue his expressions, to read the subtle signs of his stress. You saved the deal, he said quietly. We saved the deal. Her correction was gentle but firm. I just did the research. You knew exactly how to use it. Peter found himself studying her face, the intelligence in her dark eyes, the calm confidence in her posture, the way she deflected praise without diminishing her own contribution. When had someone last worked with him instead of simply for him? Thank you, he said, and meant it more than he'd meant anything in months. You're welcome. She hesitated at the doorway. Mr. Johnson, it's almost 7. You should probably go home. I have the Patterson report to finish. The Patterson report can wait until Monday. Her voice carried a note of gentle authority that surprised them both. You've earned a weekend. Before he could respond, she was gone, leaving him alone with the strange realization that someone was looking out for his well-being, not because it benefited them, but because she cared. Peter did go home that night, for the first time in months, before 9 o'clock. His Beacon Hill townhouse felt larger and emptier than usual, but not as oppressive as it once had. He found himself wondering what Naomi did with her Friday nights. Did she have friends, family, someone special waiting for her? The thought of Naomi with someone else created an unexpected knot in his stomach that he quickly pushed aside. Saturday morning, he woke thinking about her laugh. He'd heard it only once, when she'd been on the phone with her sister thinking he was in meetings. It had been warm and unguarded, and completely infectious. By Sunday evening, Peter Johnson, CEO, millionaire, master of emotional compartmentalization, was forced to admit a terrifying truth. He was looking forward to Monday morning not because of work, but because Naomi Reed would be there. And that recognition brought with it a flood of guilt so intense it nearly staggered him. Samantha, his wife's name whispered through his mind like an accusation. How could he look forward to seeing another woman? How could he find himself thinking about Naomi's smile, her voice, her gentle presence, when Samantha was cold and alone in the ground because he'd been too late to save her? Peter stood at his bedroom window, looking out at the city lights, fighting the familiar war between the man he was becoming around Naomi and the man he'd sworn to remain, loyal to a ghost, faithful to guilt, committed to emptiness as penance for his failures. But even as he made that familiar vow to maintain distance, to keep things strictly professional, to honor his wife's memory by denying himself connection, even then, he couldn't quite bring himself to throw away the small collection of handwritten notes in his desk drawer, because some part of him, the part that was slowly, dangerously coming back to life, knew that Naomi Reed wasn't trying to replace what he'd lost. She was simply trying to help him remember what it felt like to live. As Peter's walls begin to crack, his guilt grows stronger. Will his loyalty to the past prove stronger than his growing need for Naomi? And how long can she continue to care for someone who's afraid to let himself be cared for? Sometimes the loudest cry for help comes wrapped in perfect composure. Tuesday arrived with October rain drumming against the windows of Meridian Tower, and Peter sat in his office, staring at his calendar with the kind of dread that had become as familiar as his morning coffee. 3:00 p.m. The appointment that never appeared on any official schedule. The commitment that had ruled his Tuesdays for 738 days. Mount Auburn Cemetery. Section 15. The headstone that read Samantha Claire Johnson, beloved wife, in elegant script that somehow made the finality feel both more real and completely impossible. Mr. Johnson? Naomi's voice drifted through his thoughts. The quarterly reports are ready for your review. He looked up to find her standing in his doorway, and for a moment the guilt was so sharp it nearly took his breath away. How could he sit here thinking about visiting his wife's grave, while simultaneously cataloguing the way afternoon light caught in Naomi's hair? How could he feel both devastating loss and unexpected warmth at the same time? "Leave them on my desk," he said, his voice cooler than it had been in days. Something flickered across Naomi's expression. Not hurt, exactly, but recognition. She set the reports down carefully, her movements deliberate and graceful. "Is there anything else you need before this afternoon?" The question was professional, but underneath it Peter heard something else. Understanding, maybe, or patience. No. He turned back to his computer screen, dismissing her with the kind of cold efficiency he'd perfected over the past 2 years. Naomi didn't leave immediately. She stood there for several seconds, and Peter could feel her presence like warmth against his back. Finally, she spoke. "Mr. Johnson, rain makes everything feel heavier sometimes, but it also makes things grow." Before he could respond, she was gone, leaving him staring at his reflection in the dark computer screen and wondering how she always managed to say exactly what he didn't know he needed to hear. At 2:45, Peter gathered his coat and headed for the elevator. He'd made this trip every Tuesday for 2 years, through seasons and weather, through good days and devastating ones. Today felt different somehow, weighted with more than just grief. "Mr. Johnson." He turned to find Naomi at her desk, watching him with those perceptive dark eyes. "Take your time," she said softly. "I'll handle everything here." She knew, somehow, without him ever explaining, without him ever sharing the details that felt too raw to speak aloud. She understood that Tuesday afternoons weren't about business. They were about something infinitely more personal and painful. "Thank you," he managed, the words feeling inadequate for the relief that flooded through him. The drive to Mount Auburn took 23 minutes in Tuesday traffic. Peter had timed it so many times he could predict it to the minute. The cemetery gates were familiar now, as was the winding path to Section 15, as was the bench positioned exactly 12 feet from Samantha's headstone. He always sat on the bench first, never approached the grave directly. It was a ritual born of cowardice, he supposed, the need to work up courage to face the physical reality of his loss. Today, the bench was wet from rain. Peter sat anyway, letting the dampness seep through his expensive coat. "I hired someone new," he said aloud, his voice barely audible above the rain. "Her name is Naomi." The words hung in the grey air, and immediately the guilt crashed over him like a tide. Saying her name here in this sacred space of grief felt like the worst kind of betrayal. "I don't know why I'm telling you that," he continued, his voice rougher now. "Nothing's happening. Nothing will happen. I just—" What? What was he trying to say? That for the first time in 2 years, he'd caught himself laughing at something. That someone had made him remember what it felt like to be cared for. That the crushing weight of surviving felt just a little bit lighter. "She leaves me notes," he whispered. "Small things like you used to do." The comparison felt wrong the moment he made it. Naomi's notes weren't like Samantha's love letters. They were different, quieter, less romantic, more observational. Where Samantha had been fire and passion and overwhelming life, Naomi was steady warmth and gentle understanding. Peter stood abruptly, walking to the headstone with jerky, agitated movements. "I don't know what I'm doing, Sam," he said, pressing his palm against the cold marble. "I promised myself I wouldn't, that I wouldn't move on, that staying empty was the least I owed you after failing to save you." Rain mixed with something warmer on his cheeks. "But she's not trying to replace you. She's not trying to fix me, or save me, or make me forget. She's just there, and I don't know how to handle that." The cemetery was silent, except for rain on leaves and distant traffic. No divine wisdom, no signs, no clear path forward. Just Peter, standing in the rain, talking to marble and earth and memories. "What am I supposed to do?" he asked the headstone, the sky, the universe that had taken everything good from his life, and then, inexplicably, sent him Naomi Reed. No answer came. But for the first time in 2 years, Peter found himself wondering if maybe, the question itself was progress. When he returned to the office at 4:30, soaked and emotionally drained, Naomi didn't comment on his appearance or ask intrusive questions. She simply handed him a steaming cup of coffee and a small towel. "The Henderson meeting got moved to tomorrow," she said matter-of-factly. "And Mario Balotelli called to confirm Thursday's lunch. I told him you'd call back in the morning." Peter accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping his cold hands around the warm ceramic. "Thank you. Of course." She turned to leave, then paused. "Mr. Johnson? There's soup in the break room, tomato basil. I thought—" Well, it seemed like a soup kind of day. She disappeared before he could respond, and Peter found himself standing in his office, holding coffee that tasted like comfort. thinking about soup made by someone who noticed when he needed warmth. An hour later, when he ventured to the break room, he found a thermos of soup waiting on the counter with another small note. Some Tuesdays are harder than others. You don't have to carry everything alone. Peter ate the soup standing at the window, watching rain streak down glass, and for the first time since Samantha's death, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that healing didn't have to mean forgetting, that moving forward didn't have to mean leaving her behind, and that maybe, just maybe, there was room in a broken heart for more than just grief. That evening, Peter worked later than usual, partly from necessity, and partly because going home meant being alone with thoughts that felt too big and too dangerous to examine closely. At 8 o'clock, he noticed light still spilling from Naomi's workspace. He found her at her desk, a takeout container of salad beside her keyboard, working on what looked like a comprehensive reorganization of his filing system. "Ms. Reed," his voice came out softer than he'd intended. "You should go home." She looked up, and in the artificial light of the office, her face was luminous and kind. "I'm almost finished," she said. "Besides, someone needs to make sure you remember to eat dinner. That's not your job." "No," she agreed, "but caring about people isn't really a job, it's just who you are." The simple statement hit him like a physical blow. When had someone last cared about his basic human needs? When had someone noticed whether he ate, slept, took care of himself beyond the mechanical requirements of staying alive? Naomi. Her first name slipped out before he could stop it, intimate and warm in the quiet office. She smiled, really smiled, for the first time since he'd known her. "Yes, Peter." The sound of his name in her voice sent something electric and terrifying through his chest. They stood there in the glow of desk lamps and city lights, separated by 3 feet of space that suddenly felt both insurmountable and negligible. "Nothing," he said finally. "Just thank you. For today, for the soup, for understanding what I couldn't say." "Everyone needs someone who understands," Naomi said quietly, "even when they can't explain what there is to understand. Especially then." The words hung unspoken between them, loaded with recognition and possibility, and the kind of dangerous hope that Peter had spent 2 years learning to avoid. But as he watched Naomi gather her things, as he found himself memorizing the graceful curve of her neck and the way her hands moved with quiet purpose, Peter realized that avoidance was becoming impossible, because Naomi Reed wasn't just breaking down his walls anymore, she was making him want to help her do it. Peter's carefully constructed barriers are cracking under the weight of Naomi's gentle persistence, but with growing feelings comes growing guilt. Can he find peace with his past, or will his loyalty to a ghost destroy his chance at a future? The most dangerous moment isn't when walls come down, it's when you realize you want them to. Thursday evening arrived with the kind of exhaustion that comes from fighting yourself all day. Peter had spent the 48 hours since Tuesday's cemetery visit in a constant state of internal warfare, part of him craving Naomi's presence, part of him consumed with guilt for that very craving. The office had emptied hours ago, but neither of them had made any move to leave. Peter sat at his desk, pretending to review contracts while actually watching Naomi through his office's glass walls as she organized files with her characteristic grace and efficiency. She'd changed from her heels into comfortable flats at some point during the day, a small detail that felt absurdly intimate to witness. Her hair had loosened slightly from its morning style, soft tendrils framing her face as she worked. Every few minutes, she would tuck a strand behind her ear in a gesture so unconsciously feminine it made Peter's chest tighten with want he had no right to feel. "Mr. Johnson," her voice broke through his thoughts. "I'm going to grab some coffee. Would you like some?" "Yes, no. Stay where I can see you. Leave before I do something we'll both regret." "Please," he heard himself say. Minutes later, Naomi appeared in his doorway carrying 2 steaming mugs, her presence filling the space with warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee. She set his cup on the desk with careful precision, and when her fingers accidentally brushed his, Peter felt electricity shoot up his arm. She noticed. He saw it in the slight widening of her eyes, the soft intake of breath. For a moment they both stared at their hands, hers still extended, his wrapped around the warm ceramic, the space between them charged with possibility. "Naomi." Her name came out rougher than he intended, and she looked up to meet his gaze directly. "Yes?" The simple word hung between them, loaded with invitation and question, and something that felt dangerously close to permission. Peter started, then stopped, lost in the depths of her dark eyes, eyes that saw too much, understood too well, offered too much comfort for a man who'd convinced himself he didn't deserve any. "You can tell me," she said softly, settling into the chair across from his desk. "Whatever it is, I'm not going anywhere. I'm not going anywhere." The promise hit him like a physical blow. When had someone last said that to him and meant it? When had someone last offered to stay through whatever storm he might bring? "My wife died 2 years ago," he said suddenly, the words tumbling out before his defenses could stop them. Naomi didn't flinch, didn't offer empty platitudes or awkward condolences. She simply nodded, her expression gentle and patient, waiting for him to continue. "Car accident. Black ice." Peter's voice was barely above a whisper. "I was supposed to pick her up from her book club that night. I was running late, some crisis at the office that couldn't wait until morning." His hands trembled around the coffee cup, and he set it down carefully. "By the time I got to the hospital," he closed his eyes, seeing again the sterile hallway, the doctor's apologetic face, the crushing weight of forever settling on his shoulders. She was already gone. Peter. His name in her voice was like a balm, gentle and non-judgmental and somehow healing. "I promised her I'd be there," he continued, the words coming faster now, 2 years of bottled grief finally finding an outlet. "She called me at 8:30, laughing about something ridiculous one of the women had said, asking if I was still coming. I told her I'd be there by 9:15. At 9:20 I was still in this office, arguing with lawyers about a contract that didn't matter to anyone." Naomi leaned forward slightly, her entire focus on him, and Peter felt something crack open in his chest. "They said she died instantly, no pain, no awareness, but she was alone." His voice broke. "She was alone because I chose work over the woman I loved more than my own life." Tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed in months burned behind his eyes. "So, I don't get to—" He gestured helplessly between them. "I don't get to feel this, whatever this is. Because feeling anything for someone else means I've forgotten her, means I've moved on from the one person I should have protected and failed." The office fell silent, except for the distant hum of the city beyond the windows. Peter sat rigid in his chair, horrified that he'd revealed so much, terrified of what Naomi might say, how she might try to fix him or absolve him or minimize his guilt. Instead, she did something unexpected. She reached across the desk and placed her hand over his. "Peter," she said quietly, "you didn't fail her. You made a choice that millions of people make every day. You prioritized work because you thought there would be time for everything else later. You couldn't have known. But I should have known." The words came out harsh, desperate. "I should have dropped everything and gone to her immediately. I should have—" "You should have been psychic." Naomi's voice carried gentle challenge. "You should have known that this one time, unlike the hundreds of other times you'd been late, something terrible would happen." Peter stared at her, struck by the simple logic he'd never allowed himself to consider. "Survivor's guilt is real," she continued, her thumb moving softly across his knuckles. "But survival isn't a betrayal. Living isn't a betrayal. And loving again—" She paused, meeting his eyes with steady courage. "Loving again isn't erasing what came before. It's honoring it by choosing to keep your heart open instead of closed." The words hit him like a revelation, like lightning, like the first breath after drowning. For 2 years, he'd seen moving forward as betrayal, healing as infidelity, happiness as dishonor to Samantha's memory. But looking at Naomi, at her strength, her wisdom, her refusal to let him drown in guilt he didn't deserve, Peter began to see another possibility. That maybe Samantha, who had loved him fiercely and completely, wouldn't want him to spend his life in penance. That maybe the greatest honor he could give her memory was to live fully, love deeply, choose joy whenever he found it. "I think about you," he whispered, the confession torn from somewhere deep and desperate. "More than I should, more than I have any right to." "Peter." Naomi's voice was barely audible. He stood abruptly, moving around the desk until he was standing directly in front of her chair. She looked up at him with those intelligent, compassionate eyes, and Peter felt himself drowning in want and guilt and terrifying, overwhelming need. "I think about touching you," he continued, his voice raw with honesty. "I think about what it would feel like to kiss you, to hold you, to make love to you. I think about waking up next to you and falling asleep with your body against mine. And then I hate myself for those thoughts because they feel like cheating on a ghost, like betraying 2 years of celibacy that felt like the only way to honor what I lost." Naomi rose slowly, bringing herself within inches of him, close enough that he could smell her perfume, something soft and floral that made him think of spring mornings and fresh beginnings. "She's not a ghost, Peter," Naomi said gently. "She was a real woman who loved you, and real love doesn't demand that you stop living when it ends. It asks you to keep living in honor of what you shared." They stood there in the golden light of desk lamps and city glow, close enough to touch, separated by grief and guilt, and 2 years of carefully constructed walls. Peter could feel Naomi's warmth, could see the pulse beating gently at the base of her throat, could sense the invitation in her stillness. All he had to do was lean forward. Just a few inches, and he could taste her lips, could lose himself in the promise of healing she represented. Instead, he stepped back. "I can't," he whispered, the words like broken glass in his throat. "I'm sorry, Naomi. I thought I could, but I can't. Not yet. Maybe not ever." Something flickered across her face. Disappointment, maybe, or understanding, or both. But when she spoke, her voice remained steady and kind. "I'm not going anywhere, Peter," she said again. "When you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'll be here." She gathered her purse with quiet dignity, pausing at his office door. "Take care of yourself tonight," she said softly. "And remember, healing isn't betrayal. It's courage." Then she was gone, leaving Peter alone with the scent of her perfume and the echo of words that felt like both salvation and impossibility. He wanted to heal. God. He wanted to heal more than he'd wanted anything in 2 years. But wanting something and believing you deserved it were two entirely different things. Peter has finally opened his heart to someone, but can he open it to himself? As Naomi's patience and wisdom plant seeds of healing, will Peter find the courage to choose life over guilt? Or will his loyalty to the past destroy his chance at a future? Sometimes love means knowing when to step forward and when to simply remain. Friday morning arrived with Peter already regretting everything he'd revealed the night before. He sat in his car in the parking garage for 15 minutes, gripping the steering wheel and staring at the elevator bank, consumed by a shame so intense it made his chest ache. What had he been thinking? He'd laid himself bare in front of Naomi. His grief, his guilt, his pathetic longing for something he didn't deserve. Worse, he'd almost kissed her. Had wanted to kiss her with a desperation that felt like betrayal to everything sacred about his marriage. The smart thing would be to request a transfer for her, find some diplomatic way to move her to another department, another floor, another building if necessary. Put distance between himself and the woman who somehow made him forget all the reasons he needed to stay buried in grief. But when the elevator doors opened on the 42nd floor and he saw Naomi at her desk, hair pulled back in an elegant twist, reading glasses perched on her nose as she reviewed what looked like budget reports, Peter's resolution crumbled like tissue paper. She looked up as he passed, offering the same warm professional smile she'd given him every morning for 3 weeks. No awkwardness, no pointed questions, no attempt to leverage the emotional intimacy he'd foolishly shared. "Good morning, Mr. Johnson," she said, her voice carrying exactly the right note of respectful friendliness. "Your coffee's on your desk, and I've prioritized the morning's calls by urgency. Mr. Johnson." Back to formal address, as if last night's Peter had never happened, as if he hadn't confessed his deepest shame and nearly kissed her in a moment of weakness he'd replay with mortification for months. "Thank you," he managed, his voice stiffer than he intended. Relief and disappointment warred in his chest as he closed his office door and settled at his desk. The coffee was perfect, exactly the right temperature, exactly the right strength. Beside it sat a small stack of documents and a handwritten note. "Today is a new day. Yesterday's courage doesn't have to become today's regret." Peter stared at the note for several minutes, something tight in his throat. She knew. Somehow she understood exactly what he was feeling. The shame, the second-guessing, the urge to retreat back into safe emotional numbness. And instead of calling him on it or pushing for more intimacy, she was simply reassuring him that it was okay to feel conflicted. The morning progressed with Peter making a deliberate effort to maintain professional distance. He kept their interactions brief and formal, conducted meetings in conference rooms instead of his office, ate lunch at his desk instead of venturing to the break room where he might encounter her warmth. It was a strategy that might have worked if Naomi had cooperated by being hurt or demanding explanations for his sudden coldness. Instead, she seemed to understand exactly what he was doing and responded by giving him space while still maintaining her gentle presence. When he snapped at her for a filing error that wasn't actually her fault, she simply said, "Of course, Mr. Johnson, I'll correct that immediately," without a trace of wounded pride. When he deliberately avoided eye contact during their afternoon project review, she focused on her notes with professional attention, never trying to force intimacy he wasn't ready for. And when he made the mistake of glancing up during a particularly difficult phone call to find her quietly organizing his schedule with competent grace, the look of understanding in her eyes nearly undid his carefully constructed emotional barriers. By late afternoon, Peter's internal war had reached a breaking point. Part of him was grateful for Naomi's emotional intelligence, her ability to read his needs and respond accordingly. Part of him was frustrated that she wasn't making it easier to push her away. And part of him, the part he was trying desperately to ignore, wanted nothing more than to walk to her desk, take her face in his hands, and finish what they'd almost started the night before. At 4:30, his resolve finally cracked. "Ms. Reed," he called from his office doorway. "Could you come in here, please?" She entered with her usual composed grace, settling into the chair across from his desk, with hands folded calmly in her lap, waiting, not pushing, not demanding, just present. "About last night," Peter began, then stopped, struggling with words that felt simultaneously necessary and impossible. "What about it?" Naomi's voice was gentle, curious, without a trace of judgment or expectation. "I shouldn't have. I crossed a line, professionally and personally. It won't happen again." She was quiet for a long moment, studying his face with those perceptive eyes. "Is that what you think happened?" she asked finally. "That you crossed a line? I told you things I had no business sharing. I made you uncomfortable." Peter, the use of his first name, stopped him mid-sentence. "Do I seem uncomfortable to you?" He looked at her, really looked, taking in her relaxed posture, her steady gaze, the complete absence of tension or distress in her expression. "No," he admitted quietly. "Then maybe the line you think you crossed doesn't actually exist." She leaned forward slightly, her voice becoming softer. "Maybe what happened last night wasn't unprofessional behavior. Maybe it was two human beings connecting on a level deeper than work assignments and coffee preferences. Naomi, I'm not asking you for anything," she continued, her words carefully chosen. "I'm not pushing for confessions or demanding explanations or trying to force intimacy you're not ready for. I'm simply here, doing my job, caring about your well-being, because that's who I am." Peter felt something crack in his chest, a hairline fracture in the wall he'd been trying to rebuild since morning. "I don't know how to do this," he whispered. "I don't know how to care about someone without feeling like I'm betraying everything I've lost." "You don't have to know," Naomi said gently. "I'll just have to be willing to figure it out as you go, one day at a time, one moment at a time." She stood gracefully, smoothing her skirt with hands that remained perfectly steady. "For what it's worth," she said, pausing at his office door, "I don't think your wife would want you to spend your life punishing yourself for a tragedy you couldn't prevent. I think she'd want you to honor what you shared by remaining open to love, not because it replaces what you had, but because it proves that what you had was real enough to trust again." The words hit him like a physical blow, not because they were harsh, but because they rang with truth he'd been too afraid to acknowledge. "How do you know what she would have wanted?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. Naomi smiled, soft, sad, infinitely understanding. "Because that's what love does, Peter. Real love doesn't hoard or possess or demand eternal mourning. It gives freely, hopes boldly, and trusts that hearts are big enough to hold both precious memories and new possibilities." She left him then, sitting at his desk in the golden afternoon light, surrounded by the debris of his carefully constructed emotional fortress. And for the first time in 2 years, Peter wondered if maybe, just maybe, Samantha would approve of the woman who was slowly, gently teaching him how to live again. That evening, Peter didn't stay late at the office. He drove home through Boston traffic, bought groceries for the first time in months instead of surviving on takeout, and cooked himself dinner while thinking about brown eyes and gentle wisdom and the radical courage it took to love someone without guarantees. On his kitchen counter, he found himself writing a note on the back of a grocery receipt. "Thank you for seeing me, all of me, and staying anyway." Tomorrow he would leave it on her desk beside her morning coffee. Tomorrow he would take the first small step toward believing he might deserve happiness after all. Because Naomi Reed wasn't just teaching him about love, she was teaching him about grace. Peter's walls are crumbling, but healing is never linear. As Naomi's wisdom plants seeds of self-forgiveness, can Peter find the courage to choose love over loyalty to guilt? The hardest battle isn't against the past, it's for the future. Courage isn't the absence of fear, It's choosing love despite the terror of losing it again. Monday morning brought the kind of crisp November air that made Boston look like a postcard. All golden leaves and sharp blue sky. Peter arrived at the office with the handwritten note, burning like a secret in his jacket pocket, his heart hammering against his ribs, as if he were about to deliver a declaration of war rather than a simple thank you. Naomi was already at her desk, steam rising from her coffee cup as she reviewed what looked like quarterly projections. She wore a burgundy sweater that complemented her dark skin beautifully, and her hair fell in loose waves around her shoulders, more casual than her usual professional style, but somehow even more breathtaking. "Good morning, Mr. Johnson," she said, looking up with that warm smile that had become the best part of his day. "Good morning." Peter's voice came out rougher than intended as he pulled the crumpled receipt from his pocket. "I have something for you." He placed the note beside her keyboard before he could lose his nerve, then retreated to his office like a teenager who'd just passed a love letter in the hallway. Through his glass walls, he watched Naomi unfold the paper, her expression shifting from curious to soft as she read his words. When she looked up, their eyes met across the space between their offices, and Peter felt something shift inside him, a subtle but seismic movement, like the first crack in winter ice. She mouthed 2 words, "Thank you," and Peter smiled, actually smiled, for the first time in longer than he could remember. The morning passed with an undercurrent of electricity neither of them acknowledged directly, but Peter noticed everything. The way Naomi hummed softly while she worked, the graceful efficiency of her movements, the small glances she stole in his direction when she thought he wasn't looking. At noon, she knocked on his doorframe. "Mr. Johnson, I'm going to grab lunch. The weather's too beautiful to eat inside. Would you like me to bring you something back?" Peter looked past her to the windows, where November sun streamed through glass and painted everything golden. For 2 years he'd eaten lunch at his desk without regard for weather or seasons or the simple pleasure of natural light on his face. "Actually," he heard himself say, "I think I'll join you." Naomi's surprise was subtle but unmistakable. "Of course. There's a nice cafe about 3 blocks east that has outdoor seating." 20 minutes later, they sat at a small table outside Bella Vista Cafe, surrounded by the buzz of city life and the rustle of autumn leaves. Peter couldn't remember the last time he'd sat in the sun just to feel its warmth. Couldn't remember when food had tasted like something other than fuel to keep his body functioning. "This is nice," Naomi said, unwrapping her sandwich with the same careful precision she brought to everything. "I've been wanting to try this place since I started working downtown." "How long have you been in Boston?" Peter asked, realizing with surprise that despite 3 weeks of working together, he knew almost nothing about her life outside their office. 2 years. I moved here from Atlanta after my divorce." The word hung between them, simple and honest, and Peter felt a strange relief that she'd shared something personal without being asked. "I'm sorry," he said automatically. "Don't be." Naomi's voice was matter-of-fact, free of bitterness or regret. "It was the right decision for both of us. Sometimes love isn't enough to bridge fundamental incompatibilities." She paused, considering her words carefully. "Marcus was a good man, successful, charming, everything that looked perfect on paper, but he wanted a wife who would make his life smoother, more comfortable. I needed a partner who would challenge me to grow." Peter leaned forward, intrigued by her openness. "What happened?" "We spent 3 years trying to change each other instead of accepting who we were." Naomi's fingers traced patterns on the table. "He thought my career ambitions were cute until they interfered with his social calendar. I thought his traditional values were charming until I realized he expected me to give up everything I'd worked for to play hostess to his business associates." Peter studied her face, noting the absence of pain or anger in her expression. "You sound like you've made peace with it." "I have." She took a small bite of her sandwich, chewing thoughtfully. "It took time, but I learned that endings don't have to be failures. Sometimes they're just completions. The end of one chapter so another can begin. The end of one chapter so another can begin." The words resonated through Peter's chest like church bells, profound and somehow healing. "Is that why you moved to Boston? For a new chapter?" Naomi smiled, and for a moment she looked younger, more vulnerable. "Partly, but mostly I moved because I wanted to live somewhere that felt full of possibilities. Atlanta was beautiful, but it was also full of memories that kept me looking backward instead of forward." Peter understood that feeling with devastating clarity. "And Boston feels like looking forward?" "It does now." She met his eyes directly, and there was something in her gaze that made his breath catch, especially lately. They sat in comfortable silence, surrounded by the ordinary magic of sun and conversation and shared understanding. Peter found himself watching the way light caught in Naomi's hair, the graceful movement of her hands, the soft curve of her lips when she smiled. For the first time in 2 years, he wasn't thinking about the past. He was completely, utterly present. "Peter," Naomi said softly, and the sound of his name in her voice sent warmth spreading through his chest. "Yes? Thank you. For the note this morning. For lunch. For—" She paused, searching for words. "For letting me see who you really are underneath all that careful control." "I don't feel very controlled around you," he admitted, the honesty surprising them both. "Good." Her smile was radiant, transformative. "Control is overrated anyway." They walked back to the office slowly, neither eager to return to the formal boundaries of their professional relationship. Peter found himself matching his pace to Naomi's, acutely aware of her presence beside him, the subtle scent of her perfume, the way her hand swung gently as she walked. In the elevator, they stood closer than necessary, and Peter felt the warmth radiating from her body like a promise. "Naomi," he said, as the floors ticked by. "Yes?" He turned to face her fully, taking in the intelligence in her dark eyes, the gentle curve of her mouth, the patient kindness that had somehow broken through defenses he'd thought were impenetrable. "I want to try," he said quietly. "I don't know what that looks like or how to do it right, but I want to try. With you." Her smile was like sunrise, gradual and glorious and full of possibility. "We don't have to figure it all out today," she said gently. "We just have to be willing to take it one step at a time." The elevator dinged softly as they reached their floor, but neither of them moved toward the opening doors. "Naomi," Peter said again, and this time there was something different in his voice, something raw and honest and brave. "Yes? Would you have dinner with me tonight? Not as your boss asking his assistant, but as—" He struggled for words to define what they were becoming. "As a man who would very much like to spend more time with a woman he finds remarkable in every way." Her answer came without hesitation. "I would love that." The elevator doors slid closed again, carrying them back down to the lobby, but neither of them cared. They were too busy looking at each other, too busy marveling at the courage it had taken to ask, and the grace it had taken to accept. 8 o'clock, Peter asked. 8 o'clock, Naomi confirmed. As the elevator carried them back up to the 42nd floor, Peter felt something he hadn't experienced in 753 days. Anticipation for tomorrow. And for the first time since losing Samantha, the future looked less like an endurance test and more like an adventure waiting to unfold. That evening, Peter stood in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie for the 4th time, and wondering when he'd turned into a nervous teenager. He'd chosen his clothes carefully, charcoal slacks, navy button-down, no jacket, elegant but not overly formal, accessible but still respectful of the significance of what they were about to do. A first date. At 39 years old, after 2 years of emotional hibernation, he was going on a first date with a woman who had somehow made him remember what it felt like to hope. His phone buzzed with a text. "Looking forward to tonight. Thank you for being brave enough to ask." Peter smiled, typing back, "Thank you for being patient enough to wait." Because that's what love was, he was beginning to understand. Not just the courage to reach out, but the grace to remain within reach. Not just the strength to take risks, but the wisdom to honor the pace of healing. And tonight, for the first time in 2 years, Peter Johnson was ready to take the first real step toward tomorrow. The walls are finally down, and Peter has chosen love over fear. But first dates are just the beginning. Can two wounded hearts learn to heal together? And what will happen when they discover that sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the simple courage to try? Some conversations happen with words, others happen with glances, touches, and the space between heartbeats. The restaurant Peter had chosen, Sorrelina in the Back Bay, struck the perfect balance between intimate and unpretentious. Warm lighting, exposed brick walls, and the soft murmur of conversation created an atmosphere that felt both sophisticated and comfortable. He arrived 15 minutes early, partly from nervousness, and partly because he wanted to compose himself before seeing Naomi outside the familiar territory of their office. At exactly 8 o'clock she appeared in the doorway, and Peter felt his breath catch in his throat. She wore a midnight blue dress that skimmed her curves with elegant simplicity, her hair falling in soft waves over one shoulder. But it wasn't just her beauty that stopped him. It was the way she carried herself, confident and graceful, with a subtle radiance that seemed to light the room from within. Their eyes met across the restaurant, and Naomi smiled. Not the professional smile he'd grown accustomed to, but something warmer, more personal, full of anticipation and gentle joy. "Hi," she said as she reached his table, her voice softer than usual, intimate in a way that made his pulse quicken. "Hi, yourself?" Peter stood to pull out her chair, a gesture that felt both natural and significant. "You look—" He paused, searching for words adequate to describe how stunning she was. Beautiful doesn't even begin to cover it. A blush crept across her cheeks, and Peter marveled at how different she seemed in this setting, still poised and intelligent, but with a vulnerability that made her even more captivating. "You clean up pretty well yourself," she said, taking in his appearance with obvious appreciation. Without the armor of his business suit, wearing just dark jeans and a soft grey sweater, Peter felt more like himself than he had in years. Younger somehow, hopeful. They ordered wine, a bottle of Chianti that the sommelier recommended, and settled into conversation with the ease of two people who'd been circling each other's thoughts for weeks. "I have to admit," Naomi said, her fingers tracing the rim of her wine glass, "I've been wondering what you're like outside that office, whether the man I've been getting glimpses of is real or just wishful thinking on my part." Peter felt heat creep up his neck. "Wishful thinking?" Her eyes danced with mischief. "The man who notices when I change my coffee brand, who reads my notes even when he pretends not to, who gets that little line between his eyebrows when he's worried about someone else's well-being instead of his own." "You've been studying me," Peter said, surprised by how pleased rather than uncomfortable that made him feel. "Guilty as charged." Naomi leaned forward slightly, resting her chin on her hand. "But turnabout's fair play. I've caught you watching me too." The admission hung between them, honest and charged with possibility. "I have been watching you," Peter said quietly. "From the moment you walked into that conference room, I haven't been able to stop watching you. The way you move, the way you think, the way you make everything around you feel calmer somehow. Is that what I do?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "You do so much more than that." Peter reached across the table, his fingers brushing against hers. "You made me remember what it feels like to look forward to tomorrow. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed that until you gave it back to me." Naomi turned her hand palm up, letting their fingers intertwine properly. The simple touch sent electricity shooting up Peter's arm, but it was more than physical. It was connection, recognition, the fundamental rightness of two people who belonged together. "Can I tell you something?" she asked. "Anything. I almost didn't take the job." Her thumb moved gently across his knuckles. "When the agency told me about the position, they warned me that you were difficult, that you'd gone through 7 assistants in 2 years, that you were cold and demanding and impossible to please." Peter's heart sank. "And yet you came anyway." "I came because I recognized something in the way they described you." Her eyes held his steadily. "I recognized someone who was protecting themselves the only way they knew how, and I thought, maybe I could help." "Help?" The word came out rougher than he'd intended. "Not fix you," she clarified quickly. "You don't need fixing, Peter. You just needed someone who could see past the walls to the man underneath, someone who could stay patient while you remembered how to let people in." Peter stared at their joined hands, overwhelmed by the generosity of what she was telling him. "And you thought you could be that someone?" "I hoped I could be." Her voice was soft, vulnerable. "Because the truth is, I needed someone too. Someone who could see past my own walls, my own careful control. Someone who could make me feel like taking risks again was worth the potential of getting hurt." The waiter appeared to take their dinner order, but Peter barely noticed the interruption. All his attention was focused on the woman across from him, on the courage it had taken for her to reveal so much, on the miracle of finding someone who understood both strength and fragility. "What kind of risks?" he asked after the waiter left. Naomi was quiet for a moment, considering her answer. "The risk of caring about someone who might not be ready to care back," she said finally. "The risk of believing that sometimes broken things can be beautiful in new ways. The risk of thinking that maybe, just maybe, I'd found someone worth dismantling my own walls for." Peter's chest tightened with emotion so intense it was almost painful. "Naomi," he said, his voice rough with feeling, "I need you to know something. I'm not sure I know how to do this. How to be in a relationship again, how to balance honoring my past with building a future. I'm probably going to make mistakes, probably going to pull away when I should move closer." "Peter, but," he continued, squeezing her fingers gently, "I've never wanted to learn something more in my life. I've never wanted someone the way I want you. Not just physically, though God knows I do want you that way, but completely. I want to know everything about you. I want to make you laugh. I want to comfort you when you're sad. I want to wake up next to you and fall asleep holding you and everything in between." Naomi's eyes had filled with tears, but she was smiling. "That's all I've wanted since the first week I worked for you," she whispered. "To see you choose happiness, to see you choose life, to maybe, if I was very lucky, have you choose me." "I am choosing you," Peter said with quiet intensity. "I'm terrified and grateful and completely out of my depth, but I am absolutely choosing you." They barely touched their dinner, too absorbed in each other to pay attention to food. The conversation flowed from childhood stories to travel dreams, to books they'd loved, and movies that had made them cry. Peter found himself laughing more than he had in years, rediscovering a lightness he'd thought was buried with Samantha. But it wasn't the same lightness. This was different, deeper, more intentional, earned through suffering and loss and the conscious choice to hope again. As the evening wound down and they walked slowly through the Back Bay streets, Naomi slipped her hand into his with natural ease. Peter marveled at how perfectly their fingers fit together, how right it felt to have her close beside him. "This feels dangerous," he said as they paused under a street lamp. "Good dangerous or bad dangerous?" Naomi asked, turning to face him. Peter studied her face in the golden light, the intelligence in her eyes, the gentle curve of her lips, the way she looked at him like he was someone worthy of love. "The best kind of dangerous," he said softly. "The kind that makes you realize you haven't really been living until now." Naomi stepped closer, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her body, could smell the subtle scent of her perfume. "Peter," she whispered. "Yes? Kiss me, please." He didn't need to be asked twice. Peter cupped her face gently in his hands, marveling at the softness of her skin, the way she leaned into his touch. Then he lowered his head and kissed her with 2 years of suppressed longing, with gratitude for her patience, with promise for whatever came next. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, then deeper as Naomi's arms wound around his neck and pulled him closer. She tasted like wine and possibility, like everything good he'd thought he'd lost forever. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Peter rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that for weeks," he admitted. "Only weeks?" Naomi smiled. "I've been wanting you to do that since the day you hired me." Peter laughed, actually laughed, and the sound echoed off the brick buildings around them, full of joy and relief, and the kind of happiness he'd forgotten was possible. For the first time in 2 years, Peter Johnson felt like he was exactly where he belonged. In love, in hope, and finally alive. The first kiss has been shared, hearts have been opened, and love has been chosen. But as Peter and Naomi step into this new chapter together, will the past stay buried, or will guilt and fear threaten to destroy the happiness they've found? The scariest moment isn't falling in love, it's waking up and choosing to stay in love despite everything that could go wrong. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of crisp December air that made Boston sparkle, and Peter found himself standing outside Meridian Tower at 7:15, waiting for Naomi's silver Honda, with an anticipation that bordered on teenage nervousness. Last night had been perfect. The dinner, the conversation, the walk through Back Bay streets, and that kiss. God, that kiss, that had rewritten every assumption he'd made about what he was capable of feeling again. But morning had a way of bringing doubt, and Peter couldn't shake the fear that daylight might reveal last night as a beautiful mistake. What if Naomi regretted it? What if the professional boundaries they'd crossed couldn't be uncrossed? What if he'd imagined the connection between them, the way she'd looked at him like he was someone worth loving? At 7:32, her car pulled into the garage, and Peter felt his heart rate spike. Through the windshield, he could see her profile as she gathered her purse and coffee cup, the same graceful efficiency she brought to everything. But when she stepped out of the car and saw him waiting, her face transformed with a smile so radiant it could have powered the building. "Good morning," she said, walking toward him with that fluid grace he'd memorized weeks ago. "Good morning." His voice came out rougher than intended, still caught somewhere between relief and residual fear. "I wanted to—" "Peter." She stopped directly in front of him, close enough that he could smell her perfume, see the warmth dancing in her dark eyes. "Are you okay?" The simple question, asked with such genuine concern, nearly undid him. "I was terrified you'd regret last night," he admitted quietly. Naomi's expression softened with understanding. "And now I'm terrified that I'm not good enough at this to not mess it up." She reached up and touched his face gently, her palm warm against his cheek. "Peter Johnson," she said softly, "you are more than good enough, And we're going to figure this out together, remember? One day at a time. Before he could respond, she rose on her tiptoes and kissed him, quick, sweet, full of promise and reassurance. Nothing inappropriate for a semi-public setting, but intimate enough to send electricity through his entire nervous system. Now, she said, stepping back with a professional smile that didn't quite hide the mischief in her eyes, we should probably go to work before people start talking. The morning passed in a careful dance of stolen glances and deliberately professional interaction. To any outside observer, they were the same boss and assistant they'd been yesterday, efficient, respectful, focused on business. But Peter felt the undercurrent of new intimacy in every exchange, the secret knowledge of how Naomi's lips felt against his, how she'd looked at him like he was everything she'd ever wanted. At 11:30, she knocked on his office doorframe with the quarterly budget reports. "Mr. Johnson, these need your signature before the board meeting." "Of course." He took the papers from her, their fingers brushing briefly. The contact lasted less than a second, but it was enough to remind him of how those same fingers had felt, threading through his hair last night. "Will there be anything else?" she asked, her voice perfectly professional. "Actually, yes." Peter set the reports aside and looked at her directly. "Would you close the door, please?" Naomi did as requested, then turned back to face him with raised eyebrows. "Ms. Reed," he said formally, then paused, his mouth quirking into a smile. "I find myself in an unprecedented situation." "Oh?" "I appear to have developed rather strong feelings for my assistant. Quite unprofessional of me." "Scandalous," Naomi agreed, fighting to keep her expression serious. "What do you intend to do about this situation, Mr. Johnson?" "I was thinking I might ask her to dinner again. Tonight, if she's available." "I'm sure she is." Naomi's professional facade cracked slightly. "She's been hoping you'd ask." Peter stood and walked around his desk until he was close enough to take her hands in his. "I know this is complicated," he said quietly. "The work situation, the fact that I'm still figuring out how to do this, how to balance what we're building with what I've lost. But Naomi, I want to try so badly it scares me." "Me too," she whispered. "It scares me too, but good things often do." He was about to kiss her again when his phone buzzed with an incoming call. The name on the screen made his blood freeze. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, Samantha's oncologist, the woman who'd fought beside them through 18 months of treatments, who'd been there the night Samantha died, who only called on one day each year, December 15th, the anniversary. Peter stared at the phone, paralyzed by the sudden collision of past and present. How could he have forgotten? How could he be standing here holding another woman's hands, planning dinner dates, when tomorrow marked 2 years since Samantha's death? "Peter?" Naomi's voice seemed to come from very far away. "What is it?" The phone stopped ringing, then immediately started again. Dr. Harper was persistent. She always called until he answered, checking on him, making sure he was surviving. But this year, for the first time, he wasn't just surviving. He was living, laughing, falling in love. And that realization hit him like a physical blow. "I have to—" Peter stepped away from Naomi, putting distance between them as guilt crashed over him like a tide. "I'm sorry. I have to take this." He grabbed the phone and walked to the window, turning his back to her. "Dr. Harper." "Peter, dear, how are you?" The older woman's voice was warm with familiar concern. "Dr." Elizabeth Harper had been Samantha's oncologist for 18 months, fighting alongside them through every treatment, every setback, every small victory. She'd been there the night Samantha died, holding Peter's hand as the machines went silent. For 2 years, she'd made this call, checking on the widower who'd become like a son to her. "I know tomorrow is always difficult. I wanted to check in, see how you're doing this year." Peter glanced back at Naomi, who stood perfectly still by his desk, her face carefully neutral despite the obvious confusion in her eyes. "I'm fine. Thank you for calling." "Are you sure? You sound different somehow." Different. Because he was different. Because for the first time in 2 years he'd allowed himself to feel something other than grief. Because he'd spent last night kissing another woman, instead of sitting alone with Samantha's photo, drowning in guilt and what-ifs. "I should go," Peter said abruptly. "Thank you for checking on me." "Peter, wait." He hung up before she could finish, his hands shaking as he set the phone down. "Peter?" Naomi's voice was soft, careful. "What's wrong?" He turned to face her, and the concern in her eyes made everything worse. How could she look at him with such care when he was betraying the memory of his wife? How could she be so patient when he was falling apart over a simple phone call? "Tomorrow is December 15th, he said quietly. Understanding dawned in her expression. The anniversary. 2 years. His voice was barely audible. 2 years since Samantha died, and I'm standing here planning dinner dates like it doesn't matter. Like she doesn't matter. Peter, that's not... I can't do this. The words came out harsh, desperate. I thought I could, but I can't. I can't move on, can't pretend that what we're doing isn't a betrayal of everything she and I shared. Naomi took a step toward him, her hand outstretched, but Peter backed away. I'm sorry, he said, his voice breaking. I'm so sorry, Naomi. You deserve someone who can love you completely, without reservations, without guilt, someone who isn't haunted by ghosts. Peter, please, I think it would be best if you transferred to another department, he continued, each word feeling like broken glass in his throat. I'll make sure it comes with a promotion, an increase in salary. You won't be punished for my inability to keep personal and professional separate. The silence that followed was deafening. Naomi stood frozen for several seconds, her face cycling through hurt, disappointment, and finally a kind of resigned understanding that somehow made it worse. If that's what you want, she said quietly, it is. The lie felt like acid on his tongue, but Peter forced himself to maintain eye contact, to let her see the coldness he was projecting, even though it was tearing him apart inside. I'll submit the request this afternoon, she said, her voice steady despite the pain he could see in her eyes. I assume you'll want the transition completed as quickly as possible. Yes. Naomi nodded once, professionally, then walked toward the door with the same grace she'd shown since the first day she'd walked into his life. At the threshold, she paused without turning around. For what it's worth, Peter, she said softly, I don't think loving again dishonors what you had with Samantha. I think it honors it by proving that what you shared was real enough to trust again. Then she was gone, leaving Peter alone with his guilt, his fear, and the crushing realization that in trying to protect Samantha's memory, he'd just destroyed his chance at happiness. And for the first time since her death, Peter wondered if maybe some betrayals were worse than others. Maybe the greatest betrayal wasn't moving on from love. Maybe it was refusing to, when love offered itself again. Peter has chosen fear over love, past over present. As the anniversary of Samantha's death approaches and Naomi prepares to leave his life forever, will Peter find the strength to fight for what matters most? Or will guilt rob him of the future Samantha would have wanted him to have? Sometimes the greatest act of love isn't holding on, it's knowing when to release what's gone so you can embrace what's possible. December 15th arrived with a Boston blizzard that seemed designed to match Peter's internal storm. He stood at his bedroom window at 5:47 a.m., watching snow erase the familiar landscape, making the world look foreign and new. 2 years. 730 days since Samantha's last breath, since the machines went silent, since his world ended in a sterile hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and broken dreams. But today, instead of the familiar ritual of grief, the flowers, the cemetery visit, the evening spent drowning in guilt, Peter felt something different. Empty, yes, but not in the way he was accustomed to. This was the emptiness that comes after you've torn out your own heart and handed it to someone else, then asked for it back in a moment of panic. His phone sat silent on the nightstand. No texts from Naomi, no gentle check-ins or encouraging notes, just silence, because yesterday he'd destroyed the best thing that had happened to him in 2 years, because he was a coward. Peter showered, dressed in the black suit he wore every December 15th, and drove through the storm to Mount Auburn Cemetery. The roads were treacherous, visibility poor, and he found himself thinking about another snowy night 2 years ago when Samantha had called for a ride home from book club. But for the first time, instead of drowning in what-ifs, Peter found himself remembering something else. Samantha's laugh. Not her final moments, not the accident, not the hospital. Her laugh, bright and musical and completely alive. She'd had such a capacity for joy, such an enthusiasm for life. She'd loved deeply, freely, without reservation or fear. And if she could see him now, isolated, afraid, pushing away love because he thought suffering was more loyal than healing, what would she think? The cemetery gates were barely visible through the snow, and Peter almost turned back, but something pulled him forward, some need to face this anniversary differently than all the others. Section 15 was a winter wonderland, pristine white broken only by the dark silhouettes of headstones and bare trees. Peter brushed snow from the bench he'd claimed as his own, then sat heavily, staring at Samantha's grave. I messed up, Sam, he said aloud, his breath visible in the frigid air. I found someone incredible, and I threw it away because I was scared of what loving her meant about us. The wind picked up, sending snow swirling around the cemetery like something out of a dream. Her name is Naomi. Naomi Reed. Peter's voice grew stronger as he spoke. She's nothing like you, not better or worse, just different. Quiet where you were vibrant, steady where you were spontaneous, but Sam, she makes me feel alive again. She makes me want to be alive again. He stood walking closer to the headstone, his dress shoes crunching in the snow. I keep thinking that loving her means forgetting you, but that's not true, is it? His voice cracked with emotion. You'd be furious with me for wasting 2 years feeling guilty about surviving when you couldn't. You always hated waste. A memory surfaced. Samantha in their kitchen, lecturing him about throwing away leftover takeout. Life's too precious to waste, Peter. Food, time, love. When you have something good, you appreciate it. You don't throw it away because you're afraid it won't last. Peter laughed through his tears, remembering how she'd made him eat day-old Chinese food for breakfast to prove her point. I stopped living in every way after you died, Sam, he continued, his voice stronger now. I stopped feeling desire, stopped believing I deserved intimacy, stopped thinking any part of me was worth loving. But Naomi, she made me remember that my body isn't just a machine for getting through days. She made me remember what it means to be a man who can love and be loved completely. You would have liked Naomi, he continued, pressing his palm against the cold marble. She's kind without being naive, strong without being hard. She sees people, really sees them, and somehow makes them better just by being present, the way you used to do. The snow was falling harder now, accumulating on his shoulders and in his hair, but Peter didn't care. I think maybe you sent her to me. The words came out in a whisper, but they felt true in a way that settled something deep in his chest. Maybe this is your way of telling me it's okay to live again, that loving someone new doesn't erase what we had. It honors it by proving that what we shared taught me how to recognize real love when I found it again. He knelt in the snow beside the headstone, no longer caring about his expensive suit or professional appearance. I'm going to let you go now, Sam. Not forget you, never forget you, but stop using grief as an excuse to avoid living. Stop pretending that staying broken somehow proves I loved you more. Peter reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wedding ring, the one he'd continued wearing for 2 years, unable to remove the last physical connection to his marriage. He looked at it for a long moment, remembering the day Samantha had slipped it onto his finger, laughing because her hands were shaking with joy. Then gently, he pressed the ring into the snow at the base of her headstone. Thank you, he whispered, for loving me completely, for showing me what real love looks like, for giving me a foundation strong enough to build on again. As he stood, Peter felt something shift inside him, not the breaking apart he'd feared, but a settling into place, like a bone that had been set wrong finally snapping into proper alignment. He wasn't betraying Samantha by choosing life. He was honoring her by refusing to waste the love she'd taught him how to give. And Naomi, God, Naomi deserved so much better than his fear and cowardice, if it wasn't too late. The drive back to the city took 45 minutes through increasingly treacherous roads, but Peter barely noticed the conditions. His mind was focused on one thing, finding Naomi before she disappeared from his life forever. He tried calling her cell phone from the car, straight to voicemail. Tried the office, no answer. Finally, he called Timothy. Mr. Johnson, are you okay? The office is closed today because of the storm. Timothy, I need Naomi Reed's home address. It's urgent. Sir, I'm not sure I'm authorized to... Please. Peter's voice broke slightly. I made a terrible mistake, and I need to fix it before I lose the best thing that's happened to me in years. A pause. Then, Beacon Hill, 423, Charles Street, apartment 3B. 20 minutes later, Peter stood outside a charming brownstone, soaked from the snow and shaking with something that had nothing to do with cold. Her car was in the small parking area behind the building. She was home. He climbed 3 flights of narrow stairs, his heart pounding harder with each step. At apartment 3B he paused, gathering courage he wasn't sure he possessed. Then he knocked. Footsteps approached, a security chain rattled, and the door opened to reveal Naomi in sweatpants and an oversized sweater, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. She looked beautiful and comfortable, and completely shocked to see him. Peter? Her voice was carefully neutral. What are you doing here? I came to apologize, he said simply, and to ask if it's too late to be the man you deserve instead of the coward I've been. Naomi studied his face, taking in his snow-dampened hair, his dress clothes, the vulnerability he was no longer trying to hide. You're soaked, she said finally. "Come in before you freeze to death." Her apartment was small but warm, filled with books and soft lighting and the kind of personal touches that made a space feel like home. Peter stood dripping in her entryway, suddenly uncertain how to begin. "Today was the anniversary," he said quietly. "I know." Her voice was gentle. "How was it?" "Different." Peter ran a hand through his wet hair. "I went to see Samantha, and for the first time, instead of asking her to forgive me for surviving, I asked her to forgive me for not really living." Naomi's expression softened slightly, but she remained where she was, not making this easier for him. "I took off my wedding ring," Peter continued, "left it with her, not because I don't love her anymore, but because I finally understand that loving you doesn't diminish what I felt for her. It proves that what she taught me about love was real enough to recognize when I found it again. Peter, I love you." The words came out in a rush, desperate and completely honest. "I love your strength and your patience and the way you see beauty in broken things. I love how you make me want to be better than my grief, stronger than my guilt. I love that you never tried to fix me. You just stayed present while I remembered how to fix myself." Naomi's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "What changed? Yesterday you said I deserved someone without ghosts." "I realized that ghosts aren't the problem," Peter said quietly. "Fear is, and I'm tired of being afraid. I'm tired of choosing safety over happiness, past over future, guilt over love." He took a step closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes. "I can't promise I won't have bad days. I can't promise I won't sometimes struggle with survivor's guilt or the complexity of loving again. But I can promise that I want to figure it out with you. I can promise that you'll never have to compete with my past, because you are my future." For a long moment they stood in the warm glow of her apartment, snow still melting in Peter's hair, hope and heartbreak balanced on the edge of her response. Then Naomi stepped forward and took his face in her hands. "Peter Johnson," she said softly, "you are the most stubborn, impossible, wonderful man I've ever met. And yes, I'll help you figure it out. On one condition. Anything. Next time you get scared, next time the guilt tries to convince you that loving me is somehow wrong, you talk to me instead of pushing me away. Because we're partners now, which means we face the difficult stuff together." "Our partners," Peter repeated, the words settling into his chest like a promise. "Partners," Naomi confirmed, then rose on her tiptoes to kiss him. This kiss was different from their first, deeper, more certain, flavored with the salt of tears and the sweetness of second chances. It tasted like forgiveness and possibility, and the kind of love that grows stronger in the broken places. When they finally broke apart, Peter rested his forehead against hers. "I love you too, by the way," Naomi whispered, "in case that wasn't clear." Peter laughed, the kind of laugh that comes from pure relief and overwhelming gratitude. "It's clear now," he said. "Finally, it's all clear." That night, they made love for the first time in the soft glow of her bedroom, snow still falling outside her windows like a blessing. Peter's hands shook as he touched her, not from nervousness but from the overwhelming realization that he was alive again, that his body remembered how to feel pleasure, how to give it. "Are you sure?" Naomi whispered against his lips as they lay together afterward, her fingers tracing gentle patterns on his chest. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," Peter said, pulling her closer. For 2 years, he'd believed that desire had died with Samantha. But lying there with Naomi in his arms, her heartbeat steady against his side, he understood the difference between ending and transformation. This wasn't betrayal. This was rebirth. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside Naomi's warm apartment, two people who had found each other despite impossible odds, held each other close and planned a future neither had dared to dream possible. Because sometimes the greatest love stories begin not with a meeting, but with a choice. The choice to love anyway. The choice to try again. The choice to believe that broken hearts can heal in beautiful, unexpected ways. Peter has finally chosen love over fear, future over past. But how will this new beginning unfold? What will their life together look like as they build something beautiful from the pieces of their separate healing journeys? 4 years after loss, 2 years after love. Love isn't about finding someone to complete you. It's about finding someone who inspires you to complete yourself. December 15th, 4 years after Samantha's death, 2 years after their reunion. The morning sun streamed through the windows of their Beacon Hill home, the same brownstone where Peter had stood soaked and desperate 2 years ago, begging for a second chance. Now it was their home, filled with a careful blend of Samantha's memory and Naomi's warmth. past love and present joy existing in perfect harmony. Peter woke to the sound of coffee brewing and soft humming from the kitchen. Even after 2 years of marriage, the simple pleasure of waking up next to Naomi never lost its wonder. She lay beside him, dark hair spread across the white pillowcase, one hand resting on the gentle curve of her belly where their daughter grew, due in spring, a season that felt symbolic of everything they'd built together. Their physical intimacy had been a journey of rediscovery. Those first months after their reunion, Peter had approached lovemaking with the reverence of a man who'd forgotten his own capacity for passion. Naomi had been patient, gentle, helping him understand that desire wasn't betrayal. It was celebration of being alive. "Good morning, beautiful," he whispered, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple. Naomi stirred, smiling before her eyes even opened. "Good morning yourself. How did you sleep?" "Better than I have any right to." Peter's hand joined hers on her belly. "How's our little girl this morning?" "Active. I think she's going to be a morning person like her daddy." Peter marveled at the ease of it, this domestic bliss he'd never expected to experience again, the way Naomi had seamlessly woven herself into his life without erasing what came before. Samantha's photo still sat on the mantel, but now it was surrounded by pictures of their wedding, their honeymoon in Tuscany, quiet moments that told the story of healing and hope. Their first year of marriage had been a delicate dance of grief and growth. Peter had his difficult days, moments when survivor's guilt would crash over him without warning, but Naomi had learned to recognize the signs, the way he'd go quiet during dinner, how he'd stare out windows lost in memory. She never pushed, never demanded explanations. She simply made herself available, a hand on his shoulder, a cup of tea placed silently beside him, her presence steady as a lighthouse. And slowly, Peter had learned to share those dark moments, instead of drowning in them alone. He'd learned that healing wasn't linear, that loving Naomi didn't diminish what he'd felt for Samantha, and that happiness wasn't a betrayal of the past, it was a promise to the future. "I want to visit Samantha today," Peter said quietly. "With you, if you're comfortable with that." It had taken him 6 months after their reunion to suggest bringing Naomi to the cemetery. She'd said yes without hesitation, understanding that honoring his past was part of loving his present. Of course. Naomi turned to face him fully, her eyes soft with understanding. "I think she'd want to meet the baby anyway, don't you?" The casualness with which she included Samantha in their family narrative still amazed Peter. There was no jealousy, no competition, just acceptance that love expands rather than divides. Later that afternoon, Mount Auburn Cemetery. The December day was crisp but clear, a stark contrast to the blizzard of 2 years past. Peter and Naomi walked hand in hand through Section 15, their breath visible in small puffs, as they approached the familiar headstone. Someone had placed fresh flowers on Samantha's grave. Dr. Harper, most likely, still making her annual pilgrimage. Peter smiled, touched by the continued connection. "Hello, Sam," Peter said softly, settling onto the bench with Naomi beside him. "I brought someone special to meet you." Naomi squeezed his hand, a gesture of comfort and solidarity. "This is Naomi, my wife." The words still felt miraculous on his tongue. "I know you two would have been friends. She has your strength, your ability to see the best in people, even when they can't see it themselves." A gentle breeze rustled the bare branches above them, and Peter took it as acknowledgement. "We're having a baby in April," he continued, "a little girl. We're naming her Hope." He paused, emotion catching in his throat. "Hope Samantha Johnson Reed, because that's what Naomi gave me. Hope. And that's what you taught me, that love doesn't end when life does." Naomi leaned into him, her hand protective over their growing child. "I want you to know," Peter said, his voice stronger now, "that loving Naomi hasn't diminished what we had. If anything, it's made me understand the magnitude of what you gave me. You loved me so completely, so fearlessly, that even after you were gone, the love remained. It taught me to recognize real love when I found it again." He pulled out a small wrapped package from his jacket pocket, a tradition they'd started last year. "From both of us," he said, placing it near the headstone. Inside was a photo from their wedding day, Peter and Naomi laughing as they cut their cake, pure joy radiating from both their faces. "I thought you'd want to see how happy we are," Peter whispered, "how happy you helped make us." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the cemetery. Finally, Naomi spoke. "Thank you, Samantha," she said softly, "for loving him so well that he knew how to love me, for making him the man who wasn't afraid to grieve completely and heal completely, for teaching him that hearts are big enough for both precious memories and new dreams. Peter felt tears slip down his cheeks, not tears of grief anymore, but tears of gratitude for the complicated beauty of it all. As they walked back to their car, Naomi suddenly stopped. "Peter," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "What is it? Do you feel that?" She took his hand and pressed it against her belly. For a moment, Peter felt nothing. Then, a gentle flutter, like butterfly wings against his palm. Their daughter, moving for the first time he could feel. "She's saying hello," Naomi whispered. Peter laughed through his tears, overwhelmed by the perfection of the moment. Here, in the place where he'd learned to let go of the past, he was feeling the first signs of their future. "Hello, sweetheart," he said to Naomi's belly. "We can't wait to meet you." As they drove home through the Boston streets, Christmas lights beginning to twinkle in the early dusk, Peter reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The grief that had nearly destroyed him, the love that had saved him, the courage it had taken to choose hope over fear. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked Naomi as they sat in traffic. "Taking a chance on someone so broken?" Naomi turned to look at him, her eyes bright with love and certainty. "Peter Johnson," she said firmly, "you weren't broken. You were healing. There's a difference, and I've never regretted loving someone brave enough to heal." Later that evening, their Beacon Hill home was warm with golden light and the smell of dinner cooking. Peter had surprised himself by developing a love for cooking, something that had emerged during their courtship when he'd realized takeout wasn't appropriate for wooing the woman of his dreams. Now their Saturday evenings often consisted of him experimenting in the kitchen while Naomi read nearby, occasionally offering suggestions or simply enjoying the domesticity they'd built together. "Timothy called today," Naomi said from her spot on the couch, one hand absently stroking her belly. "He wanted to know if we'd come to his engagement party next month. Apparently, he credits us with showing him what real love looks like." Peter smiled, stirring the pasta sauce. Timothy had become more than just a former colleague. He'd become a friend, someone who'd witnessed Peter's transformation and celebrated their love story. "I'd like that. It'll be good to see him happy." "He said something else," Naomi continued, her voice soft with affection. "He told me that watching you learn to love again gave him the courage to propose to Sarah. He said you were his example, that it's possible to choose happiness over fear." Peter set down his spoon and walked to where she sat, settling beside her on the couch they'd picked out together, a compromise between his minimalist aesthetic and her love of comfort. He placed his hand over hers on her belly, feeling the gentle movements of their daughter. "We did something good, didn't we?" he said quietly. "Despite all the fear and doubt and nearly giving up, we created something beautiful." "We did." Naomi leaned into him, her head finding its natural place on his shoulder. "And we're going to teach her that love isn't something to be afraid of. It's something to be brave for." That night, as they lay in bed with her head on his chest and his hand protective over their growing child, Peter felt the complete contentment that comes from being exactly where you belong. He'd spent 2 years believing that surviving when Samantha couldn't was a betrayal. Now he understood the truth. Surviving and thriving and loving again was the greatest honor he could give her memory. Because Samantha's love had been real enough, strong enough, transformative enough to teach him that hearts broken by loss could be made even more beautiful in the mending. And sometimes, if you're very lucky and very brave, the mending comes with a love so profound, it feels like a gift from the person you lost. Some love stories end with, "Until death do us part," but the most beautiful ones end with, "Until love brings us together again." Not the same love, not replacement love, but love born from love, nurtured by memory, and strong enough to honor the past while embracing the future. That's what Peter and Naomi had built. Not despite the ghost of Samantha's love, but because of it. Because real love doesn't end. It just learns to love differently. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, it teaches us to love again. Final message. Sometimes the greatest tragedy isn't losing someone you love. It's refusing to love again when your heart is ready to heal. Peter Johnson spent 2 years believing that loyalty meant staying broken. Naomi Reed taught him that true loyalty means becoming whole enough to love fully again. Their story reminds us that healing isn't betrayal, moving forward isn't forgetting, and opening your heart to new love doesn't diminish what came before. It honors it by proving that real love creates more love, not less. In a world that often mistakes suffering for devotion, Peter and Naomi chose something braver. They chose to believe that hearts are big enough for both precious memories and beautiful new possibilities. Their love didn't erase the past. It transformed it into a foundation strong enough to build a future on. Because that's what love does when we let it. It heals, it grows, and it teaches us that the most profound way to honor what we've lost is to remain open to what we might still find. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin not with once upon a time, but with once more with courage. A question for your heart. If you found yourself in Peter's position, torn between loyalty to a lost love and the possibility of new happiness, what would you do? Would you have the courage to choose healing over guilt, future over past, love over fear? Your thoughts and reflections mean everything. Please share what this story stirred in your heart. The end. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment your thoughts. Your participation is very important to us. See you next time.